It was a Tuesday morning, one of those slow, quiet ones, where the sun felt like it had nowhere better to be but to hang above my modest, single-story home. I had just finished pouring a second cup of coffee and was standing by the window watching a squirrel try to steal from my bird feeder again, when I heard the knock. Not the kind of knock that friends use firm, fast, and official, like the kind you hear in movies right before someone's life is about to change. I walked to the door, opened it, and no one was there. Just a folded white paper half fluttering in the breeze taped to the wood like a warning. I pulled it off expecting a neighborhood update or some notice about trash pickup. Instead, it said I was in violation of multiple HOA ordinances and that my property was now under administrative review for possible foreclosure action. Foreclosure, that word didn't even register at first. I thought it had to be a mistake. I had bought this home outright with my Army retirement pay and savings. No mortgage, no liens. I kept the yard neat, never threw parties, and even repainted the fence last spring to keep everything tidy. But as I kept reading, I saw phrases like nuisance behavior, non-compliant modifications, and unauthorized exterior fixtures. What the hell did that even mean? I stood there barefoot, holding a piece of paper that somehow held the weight of a sledgehammer. My hands started to tremble, not from fear, but from that familiar heat that builds up in your chest when something isn't right, that slow-burning anger I hadn't felt since deployment. After 22 years in uniform, I thought I knew what conflict looked like. I thought I'd left all that behind when I moved into this so-called peaceful neighborhood in Willow Glen, a suburban dream nestled just outside the city. It was supposed to be a place to decompress, to raise my teenage daughter Rachel in peace. But now somehow I was being told that the house I owned, the place I worked so hard to maintain, might be taken from me by a committee of retirees with clipboards and too much time. At first, I tried to stay calm. I sat down at my dining table and started to go through the letter line by line. There were references to fines I'd never received, complaints I'd never been told about, and decisions I had no opportunity to appeal. One item mentioned an illegal flagpole. It was a 6-foot aluminum post I used to hang the American flag every morning. Another claimed I'd installed non-conforming lighting. I had replaced 2 porch bulbs with solar LEDs. That was it. I picked up my phone, called the number listed at the bottom, and left a voicemail asking for clarification. Then another and another over the next few days. No one called me back. The silence wasn't just unprofessional, it was deliberate. They wanted to wear me down, to make me feel like I didn't have any rights, like I didn't belong. Rachel noticed I was getting tense, quieter than usual. She's 17, smart as hell, and can read me like an open book. She asked if everything was okay, and I lied, told her it was just boring HOA stuff and nothing to worry about. She went back to studying for her exams, but I could see in her eyes she didn't quite buy it. A week later, a second notice came. This one was more aggressive. It cited continued non-compliance and claimed I now owed $1,400 in accumulated fines and administrative fees. It also mentioned a lien in progress. My stomach turned. I hadn't been this angry since I'd been ambushed outside of Kandahar in '08. But there was something else that stirred in me, something deeper than anger. It was pride. I had fought for my country, obeyed every law, paid every bill, and raised a daughter on my own after her mother walked out. I didn't survive all that to be bullied off my own land by a group of HOA board members who thought they were untouchable. That night I stayed up until 3 a.m., reading every page of the HOA's governing documents, the CC&Rs, the bylaws, the enforcement procedures. It was dense and deliberately vague, but I spotted inconsistencies right away. One clause said I had a right to mediation. Another said no enforcement could begin without proper notice and hearing, neither of which I had received. That gave me something to hold on to. I made copies of everything. I started a folder. I began documenting the condition of my property with time-stamped photos and kept a log of every phone call and every silence that followed. I didn't know yet where this was heading, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going down without a fight. And that's when I remembered Alex. Alex and I grew up together, cousins on my mother's side. We'd built forts in Grandma's backyard, played tackle football in the mud, and once got grounded for sneaking out to see a monster truck rally. He was the smart one, always reading law books, while the rest of us shot hoops. Now he was the state attorney, not the county, not the district, the state. I hadn't talked to him in over a year, not since his father's funeral. But I remembered what he told me then. If you ever find yourself in a corner, call me. Doesn't matter what it is. At the time, I laughed and said I could handle myself. But now, holding a second threat of eviction, I realized something else. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help. I called the HOA office again the next morning. This time, I didn't leave a message. I kept dialing over and over until someone finally picked up. A brittle-sounding woman with a forced politeness answered Willow Glen HOA. This is Cheryl speaking. I introduced myself, gave my address, and asked calmly what violations they believed I had committed. There was a pause, the kind that doesn't come from thinking, but from searching for a lie. Well, Mr. Garrett, she said, dragging my name like it was a burden, you've received multiple notices regarding landscaping issues, improper flag display, exterior fixtures. I haven't received a single notice, I interrupted, trying to keep my voice level. Not one. And improper flag display. What the hell does that even mean? Your flagpole exceeds height limitations, she said, as outlined in Section 4B of the Community Code. 6 feet, I asked. That's 2 feet shorter than my neighbor's garden trellis. She didn't answer that. Instead, she shifted. You were also seen installing a shed without board approval. That one caught me off guard. I have a toolbox on my back porch, I said. It's a weatherproof container, not a shed. Well, that may be up for interpretation, she said. I hung up before I lost my temper. And that was the moment I knew this wasn't about rules. This was personal. Someone on that board had decided I didn't belong, and they were using every petty rule in the book to drive me out. The next day, I received another notice in the mail. This one had bright red letters across the top. Final warning. It listed 8 different infractions, ranging from excessive weeds in backyard to visible tool storage. It claimed I now owed over $200-300 in cumulative fines, which would become a lien if not paid within 15 days. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was insane. They were manufacturing violations like a ticket quota. But I didn't laugh long. That number, $2,300, made my jaw tighten. I was a single dad on a fixed income. Rachel had college coming up next year. I couldn't afford to have some HOA board bleeding me dry because they didn't like my lawn edging. But I also couldn't afford to lose my temper. That's what they wanted. So I started documenting everything. Every new violation notice went into a binder. I took time-stamped photos of my lawn, my porch, even my garbage bins. I printed out the HOA's own rules and highlighted every section they were twisting. Then, just as I started to get a grip on the nonsense, the real slap came. A registered letter. Certified. Signature required. Inside it stated that the HOA had initiated foreclosure proceedings due to my persistent failure to comply with mandatory community standards. It referenced vague clauses and cited my unpaid fines. There was even a date just 45 days from now when the board would vote to authorize legal action to reclaim my property. My property. That I bought with cash. That I maintained myself. That Rachel had called home since she was 6 years old. And they wanted to take it. That night, I barely slept. I sat outside on the porch wrapped in an old army fleece jacket staring into the dark. I thought about every battle I'd fought, every loss, every time I got back up. And I thought about Rachel asleep inside with her posters on the wall and textbooks sprawled across the desk. I wasn't going to let them take our home, but I also couldn't do this alone. I pulled out my phone thumb, hovering over the screen. Then I typed a message to Alex. Hey, cousin. I think I might need that favor after all. He responded in less than 10 minutes. You home tomorrow morning? Yeah. Be there at 9. Don't do anything until then. The next morning, I was still half shocked when he pulled into my driveway in a black sedan with state plates. He got out in a dark suit, briefcase in hand, same old smirk on his face. Jesus, Garrett, he said, eyeing the letter I handed him. They're really trying it, huh? I nodded. What can they do? Can they actually take the house? He sat down at my kitchen table, flipping through the paperwork like a surgeon about to make an incision. No due process, he muttered. No hearing. No mediation request. No neutral party. They violated their own escalation procedures by at least 2 steps. His finger tapped the page. They're bluffing. But the scary part is it works on most people. They get overwhelmed, scared. They sell. They leave. And HOA gets what they want. Which is, I asked. Alex leaned back. Control. Power. Sometimes Property. Your house backs up to the greenbelt, doesn't it? Yeah. It's the only one with access to the trailhead. He let out a low whistle. Now it makes sense. That afternoon, Alex didn't just draft a letter, he unleashed a legal sledgehammer. The letterhead was from the office of the State Attorney General. Not just a friendly favor, not just legal advice, this was a formal notice of inquiry into the HOA's enforcement practices. The tone was clinical cold and terrifyingly effective. It demanded a moratorium on all enforcement actions until a formal review could take place, citing potential abuse of authority, lack of due process, and targeted harassment. He emailed it, printed it, certified it, and mailed it to every board member's home address. They wanted to play hardball, Alex said. Let's see if they like the major leagues. That night, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Hope. And just a little bit of fire. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. By Friday morning, I received my first call back from the HOA. Not from Cheryl this time, but from someone I'd never spoken to before. He introduced himself as Greg Hollander, the HOA's legal counsel, and his tone had none of Cheryl's manufactured pleasantness. It was clipped cautious and laced with something almost like panic. Mr. Garrett, he said, we've received a letter from the state attorney's office regarding your property. I'd like to clarify that the board has not initiated formal foreclosure, only exploratory discussion regarding your compliance history. I blinked. That's not what the certified notice said. Yes, well, he continued quickly. Perhaps the language was overly formalized. But I assure you there's no immediate action pending. We'd be happy to discuss a resolution and pause any further steps until we've reviewed the matter more thoroughly. I could hear the shift in power. It was subtle but real, like a dog that just realized it barked up the wrong tree. I thanked him politely and hung up. 2 hours later, Rachel came home from school in a huff, slamming her backpack on the kitchen counter. Dad, Mrs. Keene said you were under investigation by the HOA and that we might be moving soon. What's going on? Mrs. Keene. Of course. She lived 3 doors down and had been part of the HOA board for over a decade. The gossip grapevine in this neighborhood could carry rumors faster than fiber optic cables. I sat Rachel down and explained everything. I told her the truth about the bogus violations, the threat of foreclosure, and the letter from Alex. Her eyes widened. You mean Uncle Alex is actually, suing them? I shook my head. Not yet. But they're scared now. They know they pushed too far. For the first time in weeks, Rachel smiled. Not because she found it funny, but because she saw me fighting back. And I think she needed that. Hell, I think I needed her to see it. That weekend, a new notice was taped to my door, but this one was different. It was an official HOA notice of suspension of enforcement from the HOA. It stated that in light of an ongoing inquiry by state authorities, all active fines and penalties were temporarily on hold. I laughed when I read it. They were trying to save face, pretend they were voluntarily pulling back. But I knew better. Alex called me that night. You're making waves, he said. Good ones, I hope. Scary ones, he replied. Their law firm reached out to us. They're trying to negotiate an internal review so it doesn't go public. But I told them no. We're moving ahead with a formal audit. Audit. Yeah. Turns out they've been collecting special assessments for a Greenbelt Expansion Fund for 3 years. But the county has no record of a development permit being filed. My heart stopped. That's where my house backs onto. Exactly, Alex said. And your property's location makes it a strategic piece, my guess? They wanted to reclaim it, sell it, and use the cash to fund their pet project. Is that even legal? Not the way they're doing it. If we find any evidence that they falsified fines or skipped procedural steps to pressure you into selling, it's not just a civil issue. It's criminal. I leaned back in my chair, stunned. All I'd wanted was to be left alone. All they had to do was respect my boundaries. But now they dug themselves into something much deeper. The next day, I took a walk around the neighborhood. Not because I had anything to prove, but because I wanted to look people in the eye. Some neighbors avoided me, others offered quiet nods. A few even stopped to ask what was really going on. I didn't give details, but I didn't lie either. I just said, sometimes people in power forget the rules apply to them too. That seemed to land. But not everyone was happy. I noticed Cheryl standing on her porch with another board member, both of them whispering and watching me like I'd grown horns. That didn't bother me. What did bother me was the black SUV idling at the end of the street for over an hour that afternoon. No plates, no movement, just there, watching. I told Alex and he didn't hesitate. "You're filing a police report tomorrow. I'll have someone from my office follow up." It was getting bigger than I thought. On Monday morning, Rachel woke me up before school, wide-eyed and shaking. "Dad," she whispered, "someone egged the house." I shot out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. They hadn't just egged it. They'd thrown 2 bricks through my front garden, smashed the bird bath, trampled the flower beds, and spray-painted the words "traitor" in big red letters across my garage. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. I called the sheriff. They came out, filed a report, took photos, and promised to follow up. But I could see it in their eyes. They'd seen this before. Someone mad about losing control, someone connected. And they didn't want to get in the middle of a civil mess with politics all over it. But this wasn't just civil anymore. That night, I sent the photos to Alex. He didn't respond with words, just a screenshot of a formal complaint titled "State Criminal Investigation, Alleged Harassment and Intimidation by HOA Board Member S." I stared at the screen for a long time. They started this with a letter on my door, but I wasn't going to be the one walking away. The strange part about war is that it doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it's a slow, suffocating silence, the kind that creeps into your bones and makes you question whether the next move will be yours or theirs. That was what the days felt like after the vandalism. Quiet. Too quiet. I patched the bird bath, scrubbed the spray paint off my garage with chemicals strong enough to sting my lungs, and tried to pretend this wasn't taking a toll. But it was. I found myself checking the windows more often, double-locking the doors at night. Rachel started walking home from school with a group of friends, her idea, not mine. I could tell she was trying to shield me the way I had tried to shield her. And in the middle of it all, the paper war continued. The HOA didn't stop completely. Instead, they pivoted. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope with my name misspelled Garrett with 1 T. Inside was a list of community observations written like some sort of neighborhood surveillance report. It claimed my lawn height exceeded 2 inches in several areas. That I had visible clutter in the side yard, the clutter being a folded tarp I used to cover the grill when it rained. It even included a photo clearly taken from behind a bush across the street. They were watching me, documenting everything, trying to paper cut me to death. I brought the latest letter into the kitchen and laid it on the table beside the others. The folder was getting thicker, but my patience was wearing thinner. Alex called that night. "We've launched the audit," he said without preamble. "Got access to their financial records through a court order. It's bad, Garrett. Real bad." I rubbed my temples. How bad? They've been diverting funds from the general maintenance budget into a separate LLC controlled by 3 board members, Cheryl included. That Greenbelt expansion project, it's actually a shell company deal. They've been planning to sell parts of community land they don't technically own, to private developers. I felt the air leave my lungs. "Why my house?" I asked. Alex paused. "Because it's the choke point. It connects the undeveloped Greenbelt to the main road. They can't legally build access without it. They need your lot. So they tried to crush you out of it." So this was never about flags or weeds. "No," he said. "This was about greed, and they never thought you'd fight back." I leaned back in my chair and looked around my house. The walls I painted myself. The porch I rebuilt after a hailstorm. The photos of Rachel in every corner. This wasn't just a building to me. It was my second chance at life, the only real home we'd ever had. "They're going down," I said quietly. Alex didn't argue. Over the next few weeks, things began to unravel faster than I could track. First, a local journalist named Tanya Castillo showed up on my doorstep with a notepad and a GoPro clipped to her jacket. She said she'd received an anonymous tip about corruption within Willow Glen's HOA and wanted to interview me. I hesitated. Rachel was watching from the hallway, eyebrows raised. I looked at her, then at Tanya. "We'll talk," I said. "But no filming my daughter. She stays out of this." Tanya agreed. That night, the story aired on the local news. Homeowner targeted by HOA, possible retaliation over land dispute. They didn't name names, but the implications were loud and clear. The next day, Cheryl's car wasn't in her driveway. By the weekend, a new sign was up at the front of the HOA office. Closed until further notice. But that didn't stop the mail. This time, it came from their lawyer, Greg Hollander, again. A long-winded letter requesting cordial mediation and proposing a meeting to resolve matters in good faith. I sent it straight to Alex. He called me the next morning. They're stalling, he said, trying to buy time while they clean up the books, but it's too late. We've already turned it over to the Attorney General's Public Integrity Unit. That made my stomach twist. I knew what that meant. Indictments were possible. Rachel noticed me pacing and asked, "Are they going to jail?" Maybe I said honestly. She sat quietly for a moment, then asked, "Does that make you feel better?" I didn't know how to answer her, because part of me, the soldier part, wanted justice served, hot and brutal. But the father part of me, the man who just wanted peace, felt tired. Like I'd already paid enough just defending my ground. The following week, the neighborhood began to shift. People who had avoided me for months now waved from their driveways. A few dropped off cookies or apologized for believing rumors. One even brought over a stack of HOA minutes they'd quietly copied over the years. Just in case someone ever stood up to them, she said with a smile. It was strange how quickly silence could turn into support. But then again, most people aren't cowards, they're just scared. And sometimes it only takes one person to make them realize they don't have to be. I hadn't won yet, not officially, but I felt it coming. And for the first time in a long time, I slept through the night. It was late October when I finally let myself breathe. The air was cooler crisp in that early autumn kind of way, when the smell of the dry leaves makes you nostalgic for things you didn't even know you missed. I stood out back under the oak tree Rachel and I planted when we first moved in, sipping coffee and watching the sky change color. For a moment, I forgot all about HOA boardrooms and lawsuits. It was just me, the breeze, and the tree that had grown taller than the roof. But moments like that don't last long when you're in a fight like mine. That morning, I found a letter in my mailbox from Cheryl herself, handwritten oddly formal and dated 2 days before she disappeared from the neighborhood. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was an attempt at rewriting the past. She wrote about unintended consequences, about a misunderstanding of your intentions. She even used the phrase community cohesion. But the line that got me most was the last. Perhaps if you had been more communicative, this entire situation could have been avoided. I stared at the words until they blurred. The audacity. After months of ignored phone calls, backdoor violations, and threats of foreclosure, they still thought I should have played along. That night, I sat on the edge of Rachel's bed while she finished brushing her hair. She looked up and said, "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" "Staring at nothing like you're watching a memory." I smiled. "Maybe I am." "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Yeah, just thinking about Alex, about when we were kids." She closed her brush and lay back on her pillow. "Was he always the smart one?" "Oh, yeah," I chuckled. "Once built a defense case for our dog when it chewed through Grandma's sofa. Had charts and everything." She laughed, the sound light and welcome. "I'm glad you called him. I mean it." I reached over and squeezed her hand. Me too. But the truth was, I almost hadn't. Reaching out to Alex had felt like defeat at first. I was always the one who handled things on my own deployment, after deployment raising Rachel alone, fixing everything with my own 2 hands. But this wasn't a broken faucet. This was a system, a machine. And fighting it alone would have buried me. The next morning, Alex texted, "Check your inbox. You'll like what's coming." Sure enough, a copy of an official state audit report landed in my email just before noon. 57 pages long with highlighted sections and full-color pie charts. The headline said it all. Unlawful use of funds and procedural violations, Willow Glen HOA board findings. I skimmed the summary. Misappropriation of $312,000 in HOA dues. Unauthorized developer negotiations. Failure to notify residents of enforcement actions. A deliberate pattern of targeting homeowners who lived on high-value lots for forced compliance or eviction. And my name, it was on page 7. A full case study titled, Homeowner Garrett, Improper Foreclosure Threat. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I finished reading. This wasn't just vindication, it was proof. Black and white. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I was targeted. And now the state had my back. That night, I drove out to my cousin's place for dinner. He lived about an hour away, in a house far nicer than mine with a view of the lake and a wife who always made way too much pasta. But it wasn't the house or the food that comforted me. It was sitting across the table from someone who knew me before the weight of everything settled on my shoulders. After Rachel went off to watch a movie with Alex's kids, we sat on the back porch, bourbon in hand, just like we used to. "You know, Alex said you were always the one who got me out of fights when we were kids." "Funny," I said. "I remember it the other way around." "Nope," he grinned. "You'd shove a kid off his bike for picking on me, then tell Grandma I tripped." I laughed. "I guess we've switched roles." He nodded. "And this time I'm not letting them shove you off your land." There was a pause, comfortable and heavy at the same time. Then he said, "Garrett, they're going to try one last move. I can feel it. Scared people don't back down. They double down. Especially when they think their kingdom's collapsing." I nodded. "I'll be ready." And I meant it. Because it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner in this neighborhood who'd been silenced, fined, or intimidated. Every war vet who thought he had no power. Every single parent who just wanted peace. The next morning, the email came through. Subject, HOA Special Meeting Board Reorganization Vote. It was happening. In 3 days, every homeowner in Willow Glen would be invited to a meeting. Agenda: financial disclosure, leadership accountability, and potential full board dissolution. I didn't even have time to think before my phone rang. It was Tanya Castillo, the journalist. "Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice almost excited. "Can you confirm that the HOA is being dissolved?" "Not yet," I said, "but we're close. Would you be willing to speak at the meeting on record?" I paused. "I'll be there," I said. "But not as a victim. I'm speaking as a neighbor." And for the first time since that first letter hit my door, I wasn't afraid of being heard. The day of the HOA meeting felt like a courtroom drama waiting to unfold. Cars lined the streets as residents from all corners of Willow Glen made their way to the community center, a building that until now had mostly hosted yoga classes and retirement potlucks. But tonight, it was packed to the walls. Folding chairs creaked under tense bodies, whispers buzzed like static, and people shifted in their seats, clutching the letter that had gone out days before, the same letter that dared to suggest the unthinkable, a complete board reorganization. I arrived early, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to look each one of them in the eye. Not with anger, not with pride, but with something deeper, a quiet resolve. The kind of presence I used to carry into hostile rooms overseas. There's power in calm, especially when others expect you to break. Rachel sat 2 rows back with Alex and Tanya. She wore my old army hoodie and stared straight ahead like she was watching history. And in a way, she was. At the front of the room, the remaining board members, what was left of them, sat behind a folding table looking more like exhausted PTA volunteers than the iron-fisted tyrants they had been for years. Cheryl was gone. 2 others had resigned. That left Greg Hollander, now acting board chair, his tie slightly crooked and sweat visible along his hairline. The meeting began with standard motions, minutes read, attendance, taken housekeeping items nobody cared about. Then Greg cleared his throat and opened the floor. As many of you know, he began voice-tight recent allegations and actions by external parties have placed our board under scrutiny. We acknowledge the state attorney's office has opened a formal inquiry into our operations. As such, and in the spirit of transparency, we are here to discuss the possibility of board restructuring. He glanced nervously at the paper in his hand, then up at the room. The floor is now open to comments from homeowners. For a moment, silence. Then I stood. It wasn't dramatic. No storming down the aisle. Just me walking to the front, facing my neighbors, some I knew, most I didn't, and clearing my throat. "My name is Garrett Mitchell." I began, voice steady. "I've lived here for 9 years, raised my daughter here, painted every inch of my fence, mowed my lawn twice a week, followed every rule this community laid out. And 6 months ago, I received a letter telling me I was being evicted." Gasps. A few heads turned. One woman actually dropped her pen. They said it was because of landscaping violations, a flagpole, a tarp in my side yard. But the truth was far uglier. The board targeted me because my property backs up to undeveloped land they wanted access to. And when I didn't roll over, they tried to take my home. Greg fidgeted in his seat, but I didn't stop. I documented everything. I filed complaints. I got no response. Until I reached out to my cousin, the state attorney. That's when the letter stopped. That's when your board members started resigning. The room was dead silent now. Even the ceiling fans seemed to pause. They thought I was alone, but I wasn't, and neither are you. I turned to face the board. You owe this community more than silence and scare tactics. You owe them honesty, and you owe them accountability. I stepped back. For a moment, nothing. Then a voice from the back of the room, an elderly man with a cane I'd seen walking the block for years, stood up and said, "I got fined $200 for leaving my porch light on during the day." I didn't even know it was a rule. Another woman followed. They told me my kids' bikes were a violation. They're 7 and 9. They just left them by the driveway. And then it spread a wave of testimonies. People who had never spoken suddenly found their voice. Fines for chalk drawings, warnings for planting wildflowers, threats for repainting mailboxes a shade too light. One by one, the board members looked smaller, more brittle. Greg tried to respond, but the tide had already turned. Finally, a motion was proposed from the floor. A vote of no confidence. Someone seconded it. Then the ballots came out. It felt surreal. Like watching a machine finally sputter to a halt after years of damage. People ticked boxes with shaking hands, folded slips of paper, dropped them in the bin at the front. An hour later, the results were read aloud. 92% voted to dissolve the current HOA board. Stunned silence, then thunderous applause. Greg left without a word. I didn't smile, not yet. It wasn't over. After the crowd began to thin, Tanya approached me with her recorder in hand. "How do you feel?" She asked, the light on her GoPro blinking. I looked around the emptying room, the scuff marks on the tile, the smell of too many bodies, and old fear finally breaking. "Tired," I said, "but proud." She nodded. "Anything you want to say on the record?" I thought for a long moment. "Don't underestimate quiet people," I said. "They're the ones who pay attention. And when they finally speak, they don't just make noise, they make change." That night, I stood on my porch again. Same wind, same oak tree. But something felt different. Not just relief. Freedom. The morning after the vote, I woke up to a different kind of silence. Not the watchful, suffocating kind that had haunted me for months, but something lighter. The kind that follows a storm. The kind where the air feels clearer and every creak of the house is no longer a threat, but a reminder it's still mine. I brewed coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Neighbors talking to each other. Mrs. Harlow from across the street was laughing with the Johnsons people who hadn't spoken in nearly a year since a dispute over a garden gnome. Kids rode bikes without someone jotting notes on a clipboard. People were coming out of hiding. And then the real unraveling began. Alex had warned me it would happen quickly. Once you cut the head off a snake like this, the body spasms. But I hadn't expected it to be so public. That afternoon, the state attorney's office released a preliminary findings report to the press. The headline on the local news read, "Willow Glen HOA under criminal investigation for financial misconduct and harassment." The report listed names, dates, specific financial transfers, a breakdown of the $312,000 misappropriated into a shell LLC called Greenline Community Development, with the managing members being Cheryl Mathers, Greg Hollander, and Robert Fenn, all former or current board members. Residents were stunned. Some who had blindly supported the board now stood red-faced and shaken, realizing their dues had funded not just projects, but a real estate scheme. And then the subpoenas started dropping. Robert Fenn, the board's treasurer, was arrested first, cuffed and led from his home by sheriff's deputies as half the neighborhood watched. His face was flushed, his eyes hard with denial. But the footage hit the evening news like wildfire. Greg tried to resign before his name was made official, hoping to slink away into obscurity. But Alex had already anticipated that. A cease and desist order was delivered to his law office before noon, barring him from legal practice pending investigation. Even Cheryl, who had fled the neighborhood weeks earlier, wasn't spared. She was tracked down in Colorado and served with formal charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and abuse of fiduciary duty. But as all this unfolded, I noticed something deeper happening within the neighborhood. People began asking questions, real ones. Who had enforced those ridiculous fines? Who had signed off on the foreclosure threats? Who had turned a blind eye? At first, they looked at me as the catalyst, the man who brought the walls down. But then they began looking at each other not with blame, but with something like guilt. And that guilt turned into action. A group of homeowners led by a quiet retired schoolteacher named Evelyn proposed a new interim HOA committee, one with full transparency, financial audits every quarter, and open-door meetings. They didn't ask me to run for anything, they asked me to advise. And that felt better. I wasn't looking for power, I just wanted peace. But peace, as it turns out, takes work too. During that week, I helped review landscaping policies, dug through years of digital files, and sat with neighbors I barely knew as they tried to piece together how it had all gone so wrong. The more I listened, the more I realized that many of them had been afraid, just like I had. Afraid to push back. Afraid to ask questions. Afraid to be next. It wasn't cowardice, it was survival. But now something had shifted. One evening, I came home to find a small envelope on my doorstep. No stamp, no name. Just a folded note inside. It said, "Scared. You reminded us who we are." No signature, just that. Rachel found it before I did and taped it to the fridge like a trophy. "See," she said, grinning. "Told you were a legend." I rolled my eyes, but inside I felt something soften, a kind of healing I didn't know I needed. Still, not everything was rosy. There were a few holdouts people who still defended the old board, claiming it was all exaggerated, politically motivated, or a misunderstanding. One even accused me of bringing shame to the neighborhood. I didn't respond, because the truth didn't need defending anymore. It was printed in black ink across dozens of legal documents, court filings, and news headlines. It lived in the fact that my house, the one they tried to take, was still mine. And it echoed in every conversation I had now with neighbors who had once avoided my eyes. One night I stood in the garage flipping through the thick binder of letters, photos, and notices I had kept from the very beginning. I thought about burning them, starting fresh. But then I stopped, because those pages weren't just reminders of what I endured. They were proof of what I'd survived, of what we'd all survived. So I kept them, labeled the binder HOA War 2025, and shelved it in the closet. Not as a burden, as a record. 2 weeks after the vote, I received a visitor. Not a journalist, not a neighbor, not a deputy or a lawyer. It was a man I'd never met before, at least not face to face. He was waiting near the oak tree when I pulled into the driveway after picking Rachel up from school. Late 40s, button-down shirt, expensive watch. The kind of calm expression you only see on men who are used to being in charge of rooms. I parked, got out slowly, and didn't bother hiding the tension in my shoulders. "Can I help you?" He smiled. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Vincent Hall. I represent Morgan & Lowell Holdings. We're a real estate investment group based out of San Diego." I didn't shake his hand. "I'm not selling my house." His smile didn't falter. "I'm not here to buy it. Just to clarify a few things. Off the record, of course." Rachel stood at the front door watching. I gave her a slight nod, the signal to stay inside, and she disappeared behind the glass. Vincent continued, "You see, we've had a relationship with Willow Glen HOA for a number of years. Our firm specializes in land assembly, buying up adjacent lots to consolidate for development." "I know what land assembly is," I said flatly. He raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Then you'll understand why your property was a point of interest. Strategic, you might say." "Yeah, because it blocks your road." He didn't deny it. "Cheryl, Greg, Robert, they were all working with you?" I asked. He smiled again, cooler this time. "We don't involve ourselves in how local associations operate, but occasionally, opportunities align. That Greenbelt expansion project the HOA proposed, that was our idea. A cover, really. The land behind your house would have been rezoned within 6 months. Mixed-use retail residential. You'd have been looking at triple your current value. And I was never told. Because you were supposed to sell," he said, stepping closer, voluntarily, quietly. "You weren't meant to make this difficult." That word settled into the air like smoke. I kept my voice even. "You're telling me you orchestrated this entire thing?" "No, we nudged it, encouraged it. It's what we do. Cities need growth. People need jobs. Sometimes that means older properties have to move. No one ever intends harm." I stepped toward him. "You tried to ruin me. You tried to take the only stable thing my daughter and I had." His smile finally broke. "I'm not the villain here, Mr. Mitchell. I'm just the guy who sees patterns, value, return on investment. You were the margin error, the human factor. But don't worry, we've pulled out of Willow Glen. Not worth the press anymore." He turned to leave, but paused at the edge of the lawn. "Funny thing about people like you," he said, looking back. "You don't play the game, but you still win sometimes. That makes you dangerous." I didn't say a word. He got into his car, a sleek silver Lexus, and drove off like nothing had happened. But inside me something shifted. For months, I thought I'd been fighting petty tyrants with clipboards and petty rules. But it had been bigger than that all along. It was money, land, greed disguised as governance. They hadn't just wanted me out because of a tarp or a flagpole. They wanted the land beneath my feet, the space my daughter did her homework in, the trees we planted, the porch I fixed after a storm. And if I hadn't stood up, they would have taken it. I went back inside, sat Rachel down, and told her everything. She didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised, just angry. They thought we were nothing, she said, just in the way. I nodded. They still do. People like that always will. That night, I pulled out the old survey documents for the property. Double-checked the boundary lines, the easement agreements, everything. I spent the next 2 days talking to the new interim board, pushing for preservation status on the greenbelt behind my house. By the end of the week, we'd filed a petition to classify it as protected ecological space, making it immune to commercial rezoning for at least a decade. Alex helped file the paperwork. Tanya covered it on the local news, and the community signed the petition en masse. What was once a battleground was now a sanctuary. The HOA hadn't just crumbled. It had revealed its true face, and behind the mask was something far more sinister than nosy neighbors a machine built to extract. But not anymore. Not here. Not again. I thought about Vincent's words, how people like me are dangerous. He wasn't wrong. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd learned that the most dangerous thing in the world is a quiet man who knows the law and refuses to be moved. It was surreal walking into City Hall that morning. The building was familiar: stone columns, dusty banners, the hum of slow-moving bureaucracy. But this time, I wasn't there to renew a permit or file a complaint. This time, I was on the agenda. The city had called a public hearing to address the results of the Willow Glen HOA investigation. Not just for review, but for final determination whether the dissolved board would be subject to civil penalties, whether protections for homeowners like me would be expanded, and whether the land behind my property, the contested greenbelt, would be officially designated as a protected ecological zone. I wore my army dress shirt, not to make a statement, but because I wanted to stand up straight. It's funny how certain uniforms, even worn out, even outdated, still give you spine when you need it. Rachel came with me, of course. She wore her debate team blazer and carried a legal pad filled with notes I never asked her to prepare. Alex was already waiting when we arrived, seated near the front with 2 of his team members and a thick manila folder that I recognized immediately: the full case documentation. The hearing room filled quickly: reporters, residents, a few city officials I'd seen on the evening news. Even Evelyn from the interim board was there, holding a binder of signatures we'd collected in support of the land protection proposal. Then came the mayor. She wasn't someone I'd ever thought much of before. Young, polished, always smiling on campaign posters. But today she looked serious, focused, maybe even tired, the way people do when they're finally forced to see something that's been festering for too long. She tapped her gavel once and began. Today we address the findings from the Willow Glen HOA inquiry, including allegations of harassment, financial misconduct, and civil rights violations. We also consider petitions to permanently protect certain parcels of land currently under threat from commercial development. The city attorney gave a dry but thorough summary of the report, citing every infraction, every violation, every dollar misused. As he read, I saw people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some had believed in the old board. Some had ignored the warning signs. And now the truth was being read into public record. Then they called my name. Mr. Garrett Mitchell. I stood and made my way to the podium, heart thudding in my chest. Not from nerves, but from the weight of everything behind me. I adjusted the mic, cleared my throat, and began. My name is Garrett Mitchell. I'm a homeowner in Willow Glen, a father, and a retired Army Staff Sergeant. I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist. I never wanted a spotlight. I just wanted a place to live, to raise my daughter in peace. I looked around the room, into the eyes of neighbors, officials, press. But 6 months ago, that peace was taken from me. Not by crime, not by accident, but by people who were supposed to serve the community. People who twisted rules, invented violations, and threatened me with eviction because I stood in the way of a development deal they never had the right to make. I paused, let the silence sink in. Let me be clear, this wasn't about a flagpole or weeds or a storage box. This was about power, about money, and about what happens when no one holds the powerful accountable. Rachel sat forward in her seat, hands clasped tightly in her lap. I fought back because I had to, because I had the help of my cousin, a state attorney, who didn't flinch when the machine turned on us. But what about the people who don't have that? The single mom too scared to speak up, the elderly couple who pays every fine just to avoid conflict. I took a breath. That's why I'm asking this council, not just for justice, but for protection, for oversight, for the tools to make sure this never happens again. Not here, not in any neighborhood. I turned toward the board, and I'm asking as a resident, as a veteran, as a father, that the land behind my home be declared protected. Not because it belongs to me, but because it belongs to all of us. And no one, not a board, not a company, not a developer, should be able to steal it under our feet. When I finished, the room stayed silent for a beat too long. Then someone clapped, then another, until half the room stood in applause. I didn't smile. Not yet. I stepped down and returned to my seat. The hearing continued with testimony from others, some residents, some former board members. Robert Fenn appeared via video call from his attorney's office, face drawn, reading a prepared statement full of excuses. The council didn't look impressed. By the end of the day, 3 things happened. 1. The city officially banned the HOA from reforming under any name without state oversight for 10 years. 2. All assets held under the Green Line LLC were frozen pending litigation. 3. The green belt behind my home and 3 adjacent parcels were declared permanent conservation easements protected from future development by law. I walked out of that building into the sunlight, Rachel by my side, Alex just behind us. I expected to feel triumphant, but what I felt was stillness, relief, and something I hadn't allowed myself to believe in for months: safety. Outside reporters waited by the steps. One of them asked if I had anything else to say. I looked out at the street, the cars, the sky. Then I said they tried to erase me, but I stayed. 3 months later, the air smelled like pine needles and fireplace smoke. Winter had begun to settle over Willow Glen in that slow, tentative way it always did. Never fully cold, but enough for coats to come out of closets and old scarves to be remembered. Life in many ways had gone back to normal. But I hadn't, and neither had my house. Not in the sense that it had changed structurally. The shingles still needed patching, and the fence still leaned slightly on the west side, but in how it felt to stand inside it. The weight was gone. That ever-present tension in my shoulders when I'd walk past the mailbox vanished. The instinct to check my windows twice before bed quiet now. And Rachel, she was laughing again like she used to before everything. The binder I once filled with letters and threats now sat on a shelf in the garage, unopened, for weeks. I had no intention of destroying it, but I no longer needed to look at it to remind myself of what we'd been through. The reminders were already all around me. The oak tree out back had dropped most of its leaves, but the branches looked strong this year, thicker maybe, deeper rooted. Or maybe that was just me projecting. Neighbors passed by and waved now. Some stopped to chat not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to. Evelyn and the interim board had made good on their promises. Meetings were open. Budgets were published. The HOA was no longer a secret government, but a group of volunteers doing real work, accountable to real people. I still didn't run for a position, but I attended the meetings, and when someone had a concern, a mailbox paint code, a fence height question, they asked me what I thought. They trusted me now. But more importantly, I trusted myself again. That first weekend in December, I hosted a small gathering at the house. Nothing fancy. Just coffee, hot cider, and a few fold-out chairs in the front yard. Rachel helped string up lights, and a few neighbors brought cookies. Alex drove in from the city and brought his kids. Even Tanya showed up off the record just to say hello. We didn't talk about the investigation much. Everyone knew how it ended. Cheryl had taken a plea deal. Greg lost his license to practice law. Robert was still tangled in lawsuits. And Morgan and Lowell Holdings. They'd quietly shifted their attention to another town, one with fewer watchdogs, now that we'd set the example. But more than justice, what we shared that evening was something else. Belonging. Halfway through the night, Rachel disappeared into the house and came back with a small tree sapling, a gift from one of her teachers, she said. It was no more than a stick with ambition, really barely 2 feet tall. Where should we plant it, she asked. I looked at the lawn, then beyond it to the strip of green that had once been marked for destruction, now forever protected. "Let's put it here," I said, kneeling down near the edge of our yard. She dug the hole while I held the tree upright. Alex came over and helped us tamp down the soil. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't even particularly pretty, but it was real. A living reminder that we didn't just win, we endured. Later, after everyone had left and the cider was cold, I stood out on the porch alone, hands in my pockets, watching the stars try to shine through the haze. And I thought about the first letter, the one taped to my door, the one that had set all this in motion. It had been small, just a few lines of text on cheap HOA letterhead, but it had nearly taken everything from me. My home, my peace, my sense of control. Nearly, but not quite. Because that letter hadn't accounted for Alex. It hadn't accounted for Rachel's belief in me. It hadn't accounted for the years I spent in uniform learning how to dig in when everything told me to retreat. And it hadn't accounted for the fire that lives inside people who have already lost once and refuse to lose again. They tried to push me out, but I didn't move. I stood my ground. And now, every morning when I wake up, the sun pours through the east window and hits the framed photo of Rachel and me under the oak. We're both smiling. Tired, yes, but whole. That photo isn't just about a father and daughter. It's about survival, about justice, about staying. Because sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply refusing to leave. And sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet ones get the last word.